Part 2 of our ongoing interview series on Facets of Fire Command features our Chief of Department, James O'Brien, who in his 31 years in the fire service has been an officer for 23 of them, serving as a lieutenant from 2001 until 2007, and since 2007 as our Chief of Department. This is his take on Fire Command. This is part 2 of our ongoing command interview series, where we discuss incidents through the lens of a fire officer, and this is meant not only to provide a glimpse into how fire officers process mass casualty incidents or structure fires, but also to lend advice to those who are aspiring fire officers or newly promoted fire officers. And our subject today is Chief of Department James O'Brien, who has held the rank of both Lieutenant and Chief of Department. He was promoted to Lieutenant in July of 2001, a rank he held until he ascended to Chief of Department in 2007, a role that he has held ever since. So, Chief, much like I asked Chief Johnson in the first interview that I did with him, do you recall, upon your promotion to Lieutenant, the first fire, either here in the Center District or mutual aid, that you had command of?
As lieutenant, let me think. It would probably be, ironically, the same street, different house that Chief Johnson had his first call. It was Linda Street, and we rolled up, and light smoke coming out, and people had evacuated the home. And then, so it was a two-man engine company at the time. So my driver got the hydrant, and I went and grabbed a can of irons, went on an investigation, and once I got in there, I can see it was a pantry fire where the washer and dryers are and clothing. So it was going pretty good, so I called for a line, and by then another apparatus showed up that had some support, so we were able to contain it to the room. But it was I was more of a mobile command because I was going in with just two guys. So kind of had controlled the fire, but I had it also released outside. So that was my first lieutenant fire. And I was, had some type of command.
And it's only ascended from there. Now, what's interesting is, you have a lot of guys that you learn from as you go, a lot of senior men and a lot of officers that you worked under prior to your promotion that I'm sure guided you directly and indirectly. And that all plays a role into ultimately being in command yourself. When you look back on your days as a firefighter pre-being an officer, who are the officers that you would credit with really molding your own style of leadership and the ones you took the most from either directly or indirectly?
Yeah, there, like you said, there's a lot of, in the department and others around the area that were very helpful to me. We had Chief Grant from New Haven was a good mentor for me from the time I was a volunteer in Allentown and up through my other trainings. Chief Johnson, which was very progressive for his time, firefighter. He was the chief here for many, many years. He was a good mentor. We learned a lot from him and fire attack and tactics. One of the real mentors, I gotta say, was Chief Ron Natras. Ron, I watched Ron's demeanor and how he handles certain situations and how he conducted himself with the personnel. And so those are the ones that would really stand out. There's others, I'm sure, but those names come right to mind from early days.
And those are definitely legendary names in our district. Now, upon your promotion to, as I said, it's only ascended as time has gone on, to Chief of Department in 2007. It's only heightened the size-up process, and that's a size-up that begins even when you're not an officer. You're thinking about your role and what you have to do and where you have to be. It's a lot different when you have a crew under you, as a lieutenant or captain does. It's a heck of a lot more different when you have a whole department under you, and a whole shift for that matter under you. So for you, in terms of thinking of where you want personnel, depending on where the fire is, what are some of the keys for you over the years to an effective size-up and making sure you deploy the personnel exactly where you think they need to be?
Yeah, and that comes again with experience. We rely strongly, as you know, in our department on SOPs. So SOPs are there to give everybody some direction when they arrive on scene, but they're not so strict that you can't defer depending on conditions. So through experience as a firefighter and a few other fires I got as a lieutenant, Um, you're really looking, and a lot of it's educational. You can take a lot of courses and practice. Um, the first thing you're doing is sizing up the building. And, what do we have? What's the smoke telling us? And again, reading the smoke, reading the fire, looking at the home. Um, what's the hazards? Make sure it's safe. And that's like a computer process. Boom, boom, boom. It seems like a lot, but you're doing it in split seconds. You just look at it and you know what to look for, or if something stands out. Um, and once you have a determination, is it safe? You do your assessment, and you make some decisions. Now things start going into play. We start pulling lines. We start deploying. My next trigger is, okay, where's it going to be in the next few minutes? Where's it going to be in 5 minutes? Can we get this contained enough, or do I have exposure problems? Do I have other hazards? So as each action comes into play, your mind automatically switches to the next gear. Okay, what's my next thing? And I think to be effective, you have to be able to realize and assess when you pull up, make sound decisions, and anticipate where it's going to, what probably the probability of what's going to happen next, and making sure you have the right resources for that. And if you have any question about the manpower and the staffing, call for more help. Call for more units. You can always turn them around, but if you don't want to be caught shorthanded. And those are tendencies that you have to get through experience.
Now, we all have moments, it kind of segues into something else I wanted to ask you, where we beat ourselves up naturally. We're all our own worst critic. But there's also moments where you say to yourself after it's done, okay, wow, I really like how that went. So in the last few years, it could be from any point in your career, either as a lieutenant or chief of department. What's a fire that you had command of, or safety, where you said, all right, you know what, that went really well, I think I handled it well, and obviously the guys did their thing and handled the job really well?
One very complex one comes to mind, and that was the 711 7th Avenue a few years ago. I believe it was a Saturday, and it was unusual. We caught like 3 fires in early afternoon. So they were manageable fires, room and contents or thereabouts. So, and then a 4th fire comes in at the apartment building. So we think it's an alarm ring or whatever, and I pull up, and sure enough, we have a pretty good fire rolling out on the first floor apartment on the alpha side, and it's a building full of what we know is high occupancy, and it's mostly senior citizens that rent there. It's not a senior citizen complex, but that's the majority of the residents. So we had a lot to do in short order. We had to get, and there's no standpipe, there's no sprinklers, everything's hand lines. It's a 4-story building, but it doesn't have any protection. So our units get there. Meanwhile, they're coming hodgepodge because they're all over the city. Some have a hose left at scenes and so on and so forth. So as they pull up, we got to get to work, but we got a lot of problems. And unfortunately, we also had a rescue. The resident was in the apartment that we were trying to get into. Guys did a good job. With the first units in, they got water, they got in there, and they were able to knock down the fire fairly quickly because it was on the first floor. But unfortunately, the resident was deceased. However, the challenge was we have 4 stories of people running out of stairwells, people in windows yelling for help, and it was chaotic. But I feel I think Fire Marshal Flood got there, and he helped me at the board, and we just calmed everybody down. So look, just tell people, and the dispatch is calling for all these people calling for help because the smoke's in the hallways, smoke's in their apartments. So we didn't have the manpower to search every apartment. So we had to have the dispatchers, if anybody calls, there's no smoke and no fire in their apartment, tell them to stay there. stay in place. But then as units showed up, everything went well. Boy, the next units came in, 25 came in and established a rehab and first aid with AMR, our ambulance company in town. They did triage and first aid. Others came in and searched the floors. We had mutual aid from Allentown and West Shore come in, and everybody stayed calm and did what they had to do, and we accounted for everybody. We had no other injuries or casualties. We even went down to where it was a cold day, and we had to put these people somewhere. So we reached out to our emergency management director, and he was able to get the church on the West Haven Green open, and we put everybody in the church. Because everybody was just walking away. We said, no, we got to keep everybody so we get accountability, any witnesses, so on and so forth. So, and then Red Cross and building department. So everything just came together. As chaotic as it was, I actually stood there for a minute and I'm looking, and it's like a assessment center. You know, one guy's in the window, the woman's in the window, they're banging on the windows, and I'm like, this is for real. It's almost surreal, but it's for real. But it's a classic example where we kept our heads, we used the resources we had, and everybody went to work. And when we gave it an assignment, the folks we gave it to the assignment, mutual aid companies, our guys, they got it done. And it was a team effort. It just one of those fires where everything came together. That would always stand in my mind.
We'd love to see that. Bad circumstances, but at least a good outcome.
Fortunately, yes, but it could have been much worse. We did have a fatality, but the chaos and getting people out of the smoke-filled hallways was a big task. And it was a big building, and we had crews at each stairwell getting people out and making sure that it was clear. So once again, the chaotic viewpoint of it, and we still had a moment of serenity. It's like, okay, we got this, we got that, things are coming together, and I think operationally that fire went pretty well. I think that unfortunately the fatality was there. It was already the victim was already deceased before we arrived. So.
One fire, and I've seen you at a few, but one fire that comes to mind because you had both roles was 503 Ocean Avenue in the Shore last year. You were here, as you were telling me the other day when that box came in. Originally you were safety, and at some point you transferred safety over to Captain Urban, and then you took over complete command of the operation. Now that was a fire that it came together quickly. The Savin, I believe, a festival was going on at that time. Savin Rock Festival was going on.
Yep.
And then the box comes in, and it was a heavy fire. You had wires. There was a safety hazard there. You ordered all personnel out of the building at one point, and then ended up going to a second alarm. So as far as a fire like that, talk about moving parts. You had two hazards in one besides the flames, the electrical component too, and you wore two hats there, like I said, with safety and command. Tell me about that one and the complexities of that incident and how you were able to manage it.
Yeah, that's another one that I think went well, because there was a few components to that. One, it was a Saturday, so the first arriving units from West Shore, that officer is the instant commander. So upon their arrival, before I got there, we can hear that they have a heavy volume of fire. So when I pulled up, they had it was a building on the water, a building to the side, a building in the front, and the middle building's on fire. So the exposures are starting to melt and extending into the other buildings. So those first arriving engine company and truck company, he took command, and they were knocking down the exposures, which I think was the right tactic. And I went up to the captain and I said, so listen, I'm here, what do you need? I said, I'll be safety. And then when he came back around, he says, can you take command? So that's when I took command and let them set things up. So while they were knocking down the exposures, we have a pretty good volume of fire on the first floor, and it's coming up, smoke is showing. On the second floor coming out, and then our units started showing up, and with that, the attic window just blew out. And now the other part that I was amiss to point out, we were unsure if somebody's in the house. So there was conflicting reports from family, neighbors, who's where, and so on. So we determined that the son was in the driveway saying he thinks his father's in the house. So now we're trying to make a push to try to see if we can find the dad. With that, the first attack line is now going in place to the main structure of fire where the father is, and then the whole thing lit up. So I pulled those guys out. I said, no, it's just not viable. Pulled them out, and then we ordered the 2.5-inch lines to knock everything down, visible through the windows. Once we had that down, we sent, the guys were able to go in and start doing a search and so on and so forth. Fortunately for us, the father did show up. He had gone out for a walk. So there was the determination as an incident commander. We think there's somebody in there, but we're not sure. The chance of survival at one point was, if someone's in there, the chance of their survival is minimal. So, am I going to send my crew in to facilitate a recovery or go for a save? Tough decision, but based on what I saw, based on my experience, I made that call. And even the son came in, my father's in there. My father's in there. I said, listen, we don't know that. Okay, and if he is in there, it's not survivable. So let's just see where he is first. Start calling him and so on and so forth. And like 10 minutes later, the father showed up. So thankfully, he was accounted for. But all the units did their job. I mean, everybody, there was no confusion. It was pretty cut and clear what to do. The power lines, stay away from, I believe it was the C-side power lines or D-side power lines were burning off. And with being on Long Island Sound, we had a decent wind. And that wind is what provided the fire to blow out that window like a torch. So we had a lot of components there, but overall, we may have lost the original house. We saved the other 3, and there were no casualties and no fatalities, no injuries. So yeah, it was a fast-paced scene, but I think everybody did a good job keeping it, knocking it down and keeping it real. The other last component to that is, for the type of house, the location, even with the window off the water, I had a gut feeling there was a delay in calling the fire department. So later on in our investigation, we learned that there was. People who owned the house and the neighbors were trying to get in and out of the house. They were doing this, they were walking around. None of them thought to call 911. We didn't get a call that there was a fire until somebody drove by and saw it. So everyone who lived in those complexes and in that house, for whatever reason, didn't call the fire department. So that is where, when we pull up, how did this fire get so advanced? So we thought, obviously in a situation like that, is this an arson fire? How did this thing get so hot so fast? And through the investigation, it proved not to be, but that's a component that when we walk up is, how did this house get so much fire in this short period of time? So, but that's I'm glad you remembered that. That was a unique fire.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think I recall, before I ask you the final question, the officer on 31 that day reported heavy smoke from Dawson Avenue. 31's quarters is along Dawson Avenue, so they saw it as soon as they pulled out.
A plume, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And you're good memory too, because I remember we did get people that were a mile and a half away at the festival watching the smoke and the flames from the beach. So
Marine 4 as well.
Right, they were on the water, correct. Wasn't close enough to use them, but they were on the water. Yeah. Well, like I said, the first arriving units is critical too. That first arriving crew pulled up to a high violent fire, and they knew to hit the exposures because this is already burning. They're going to start to burn. we could have lost 3, 4 houses there, and maybe some casualties, but their prompt action of getting the little resources they have to hit the exposure. They were hitting the house in the exposures, and they contained it until the mutual aid or the cavalry came. So it was well done from the first pull up to we wrapping up. Everything fell into place. That doesn't always happen. There's a lot of times where it's a root. Well, I know nothing's routine, but it should be just a one room content fire, and things go wrong quickly. So we have those days too. Yep.
The final thing I'll ask you, in line with what you just said, is we have newer officers here in our district alone. We have those who are aspiring currently to be officers, and there may be those watching this that are in the fire service elsewhere that have the same ambitions. Stemming from your experience, over 20 years as fire officer between your time as a lieutenant and of course 17 years in our chief of department, if you could pull a newly promoted officer, someone studying to be an officer to the side and give them some advice based off your experiences, what would you tell them?
First of all, the fire service is the challenge most of us are looking for. I speak for myself. A lot of jobs before this, but I get bored easy. Fire service is you can learn something every day. So to prepare for being an officer in a long-term career is stay up with what's going on. Take classes, go to trainings. Make sure your people are properly trained. Make sure you have the right mindset. It's easy to say, but just coming out and doing fires or lounging around the firehouse, and you're not preparing for the future. All right, so even we have good officers. They're probably right now our officers are probably the best trained group of officers our department's had, maybe in our history or pretty close to it, because they were taking classes when they were grade A's. They were going to trainings on their own time and our time when they were grade A's. So they didn't just wait to become an officer. And that's what we tried to instill. So I would say long time learning, find some good mentors, stayed up with the trade magazines and so on and so forth, but don't get carried away with it that every idea around the country is good for your department. You got to take bits and pieces from around, from other departments. Cherry pick is what we call it. So if what works 2 towns over, or 3 states over, or out west and down south, that may not work here. But doesn't stop you, preclude you from looking at it and getting a takeaway and then bringing it back. But I really think you got to just be progressive, dedicate yourself to your craft, and know your community. Again, we're an urban community. We're densely populated. We're very busy for a small department. We're very busy. A tanker shuttle in a rural area is a great thing to learn, but you're not going to apply it here. So that's kind of my point. I just have passion. Have passion for the job and your co-workers and the community you serve.
Well said. This concludes part 2 of our ongoing command series documenting the Center District Fire Officers. Of course, we're talking about fire scenes and mass casualty incidents through the lens of a fire officer, as well as advice to aspiring and newly promoted fire officers. Today's subject was Chief of Department James O'Brien.